Hey, Dr. Mike here. Have you bumped your head lately? Well, what's a knockin' in your noggin? Stay tuned to find out.
You're listening to Live Foreverish, a show dedicated to helping you live just a little longer. Here's your hosts, Dr. Mike and Dr. Crystal Gossard.
All right, welcome to Live Foreverish. I'm on my own today. Dr. Crystal is out on vacation, probably drinking a margarita right about now. What do you think, Hannah? Probably having a good time. Worrying about the podcast, I'm sure. I'm sure not. Anyways, we're going to talk today about concussions. You know, it's definitely in the news now that the NFL is in full gear. But of course, not all of us are professional football players. So in today's show, we're going to kind of bring it home to us normal people, I guess is a good way to say it. So I've brought in a really special guest. He has a PhD in neurosciences with a little focus on brain injuries from the University of Miami. His name is Dr. Stephen Tapanes. Dr. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk more about brain injury and concussion. It's got a nice place in my heart.
Oh, nice. I thought you were going to say nice place in your brain.
Near and dear, I would say.
So it is funny, though. It seems like the topic of brain injury, concussion, always does come back up when football season starts, right?
Yep.
But obviously football is not the only contact sport. Baseball, you slide into second. I've seen some bad collisions there. And but the point I want to make is most of the people watching this show, Dr. Stephen, they're not athletes. I mean, they're not making millions and millions of dollars and stuff like that. So I think what happens to the athlete is maybe a different podcast, a different story. This one we wanted to bring back just to the everyday person and talk a little bit about, what are concussions, who's at risk, what we can do about them if something were to happen. But before we do that, I'm always interested, especially with you PhD guys, right? I'm a clinician, right? You guys, I spent my time touching people. You spend your time in these dark labs. These weird little bubbly things coming out of flasks. So, Dr. Stephen, we have guests on. I'm always kind of interested in how they got started kind of in their field. I'm a clinician. You're one of those PhD guys. Now, listen, a clinician can't do anything without the PhD guys. I need you in those dark rooms with those bubbly things coming out of flasks, those acids and bases, and I need you figuring out stuff right at the cell level. But I guess why neuroscience? Like why brain injury? You mentioned it's dear to your heart. Like why?
So I mean, I've always been interested in biology and science in general. I was kind of the kid where on Saturday morning, it was between cartoons and Bill Nye the Science Guy, and I sort of gravitated towards Bill Nye. And then, the brain to me is something that it controls so much in the body. So it's always fascinated me how complex it is, but yet how we fit it into such a small space. And something that, geared my interest towards brain injuries and concussions is I actually experienced a concussion back when I was a teenager. I think I was about 15 or 16. So it was during a skiing trip with my family. I, went up the ski lift, boom, I got hit in a collision, had this concussion. So I experienced all these, symptoms and things firsthand. And so when I started to study the brain in graduate school, I landed in a lab that focused on brain injury and how we can, address these things that happen in brain injury, how we can try to change what's going on with some of the cells to prevent the damage. And so it kind of just came full circle where, the experiences that I've had now allowed me to be in a position I was able to research it, try to find out more, and hopefully, be able to educate people and make it something that we can approach easier.
So you were coming off the ski lift. Are you one of those guys that caused like a big pileup?
Actually, so I had gotten off. I'm a pretty avid skier for being a Floridian, I would say, right? So, as much as we can. But we decided that year that we were going to try snowboarding. And what happened is we got off the lift, and then I was going down the mountain, and I had a collision with my cousin who was, on the trip with us. And immediately I was talking to, my brother. I don't have any memory of this, by the way. This is one of the things that happens with concussions. But, he said I was adamant about I need to go back down, right? So they actually made an exception of sending me down the ski lift, which doesn't really happen often. They kind of say once you go up, you go down the mountain, right?
Yeah.
And then, that's when I got evaluated, went to the hospital, and they diagnosed me with a concussion.
Yeah.
So it's another fun family vacation.
Right. Yeah. And so I agree with you. When you look at all the different body parts, right? The brain, I mean, there's so much we don't know. So much that we still need to study and understand. And so, and I think head injuries is one of those things. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happens clinically. There's a lot of stuff that's happening at the cell level. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about some of that today. So, but if we're not the professional athletes, obviously, you're going on a vacation with your family, you're going skiing, there's a risk there. Yeah. Who else is at risk for everyday concussions out there?
In a way, almost everyone's at risk, right? One of these things is we don't plan in our day, I'm going to get up today and I'm going to slip and fall. I'm going to get into a car accident. I'm going to, have some sort of event that happens that ends up bumping my head, right? So in a way, everyone's kind of at risk. I would say that children in particular, especially boys, they tend to be a little bit more rough and they horseplay a lot. Mm-hmm. There's some data that they tend to be susceptible to these head injuries, and the elderly as well, because again they're more likely to fall, and in the event that they fall, they might sustain more damage, and so that ends up increasing their likelihood of sustaining a concussion. But again, it's just important that we have to try to not be hyper focused on safety all the time, right? But just be aware that maybe you shouldn't be running up and down the stairs. Maybe your kids shouldn't be sliding around the house in their socks, because who knows what happens.
Yeah. Which is stuff that happens every single day and every single moment, right?
Yeah.
How do you, as a PhD, how do you, when you were studying concussion and brain injury, how were you categorizing this stuff? Like, what types of concussions come out of your world and your research?
So in the research in the research field, we pretty much try to model a concussion based on what we would clinically see. And so we break it down essentially into 3 different categories where it's, mild, moderate, and severe. When we have an animal model, we have different parameters that we can adjust to mimic that injury. But from a clinical perspective, usually a mild concussion is something where someone hits their head, they don't lose consciousness, which is as good as it can be in that scenario, but they might be confused. They might kind of forget what they were doing at the time. A more moderate concussion would be something where, they might develop some numbness or weakness. They have the potential to lose consciousness, even if it's very brief. If that happens, it is imperative that you seek a physician. You have to go see a doctor. That's something that should not be taken lightly. Right. It's very serious. And then in the case of a very severe concussion, so maybe someone who got into a car accident and wasn't wearing a seatbelt, direct hit to the head, they might lose consciousness for a longer time. And that becomes even more important because the longer that you're out, the higher the likelihood you have of developing a permanent brain damage or some symptom that might last for longer, behavior changes and just trouble with memory, all these things. So it's just important that, you make sure you see a physician first off. But again, it does depend on the degree of the concussion as well.
So, that's good. That right there is some good advice, right? If you're a parent and your kid is, sliding down the banister of your stairs or whatever and falls, hits their head, if any unconsciousness happen, if you run in there and see that they're just coming out of it, or maybe they're still unconscious, right, you got to go to the emergency room. Right. Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. A lot of parents, though, let's be honest, kids hit their heads a lot, right? And not just kids. A lot of people are taking care of their parents now, right? And so, not everybody becomes unconscious after a knock on the head. So how long should you watch somebody? So somebody hits their head, whether it's a kid, it's grandma, whatever it is, they weren't unconscious. But how long should I be focused on them and worried about them and looking for progression of things?
So you should definitely keep an eye on them immediately, of course. Some of these symptoms can start to manifest over time, maybe after a day or 2 days. So it's important to keep an eye on them for at least a couple of days. You might see things, though, where, as you said, they might not lose consciousness, but, if they're forgetful or they just kind of are off, you know how your kids act, how your parents are. If they kind of just start doing things that are out of the norm and that becomes a little bit consistent in that time frame, that's definitely a sign that they may have sustained some sort of damage.
Yeah. As a clinician, as I mentioned before we started the show, I was a radiologist, and so a lot of the initial CT scans we would look at, ultimately, we were looking for bleeds. Something bleeding. They're called subdermal hematomas. And the thing about those is you may not see it initially, but those can be small and grow over time. And so I think you're right. If you're a day after someone hits their head, a couple days after, and they're still having some problems, maybe there's some numbness, weakness, they should go get checked, because that if there is a bleed there, it can be growing.
Exactly, and that's why we have to kind of do our due diligence of, we can't see the bleeds without these imaging techniques, right?
Yeah.
So we have to say, how are they acting? How are they responding to things? And using that sort of as being an at-home clinician and getting an idea based on what you know about the person to then determine, hey, maybe we should go see a doctor. Maybe we should take them into the hospital.
Yeah. So when a decision is finally made by a caregiver, okay, we got to go. We got to go get this checked out. And I'm not just talking about a follow-up like at your own doctor. I'm talking about we need to go to urgent care. We need to go to emergency care. What's going to happen when they get there?
So you'll get to the hospital, obviously, and then the doctor's going to come see you. They're going to immediately perform some sort of assessment. Usually there's a couple different types of tests that they can look at for concussions. Pretty much it's like a questionnaire, right? So the doctor might come in and say, how are you feeling? Can you remember these facts? What were you doing when you hit your head? Do you have any memory of the events? Like I said, when I had my concussion, I don't remember what happened. I remember kind of just being in the hospital, and they were like, remember these 3 things. I'm going to come back in 15 minutes. And then thankfully I was able to remember them. Yeah. And so that kind of, let them know my status. In some cases, they also do a little bit of a more in-depth assessment. So they might look at, a physical examination of your eye function, your verbal responses, your motor responses. And it's also important that they'll look into all of your history as well. So we might not be professional athletes, but there are people who have been prone to having multiple injuries. And, each time you have an injury, it has the chance of being worse and worse. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the reasons we want to try to prevent them. But so they kind of do this holistic approach of, what are their symptoms, what's their history, and then doing this assessment. And if it ends up being severe enough, they might, subject them to some imaging to make sure that they don't have any bleeding and things like that.
Yeah. So when I was in medical school, doing my emergency rotation, now this was a long time ago, Dr. Stephen. I remember taking care of some people that had concussion, but there, other than fluids, other than ruling out bleeds, there really wasn't much that we did. I remember that. Even in some pretty severe ones, it was really just let's watch them. Instead of watching them at home, we watched in the emergency room. Sometimes they would get admitted. They'd be watched overnight or something like that. Is there anything new in clinical medicine for if there are some signs? Are there medicines out there now that maybe can slow down any progression that's happening? Anything on the horizon like that?
There's studies that have been done trying to identify different compounds and drugs and things that could help slow progression or prevent the progression. But a lot of the times the issues with brain injuries is that when we try to target these mechanisms, we inherently target the good parts of the brain. And so it's kind of this fine balance where it can be difficult to identify a drug, for example, that actually works without ending up having a negative effect in the end. So there's not really many drugs that can be taken. You can address the symptoms. So for example, someone that might have headaches, they can take a Tylenol. But still, there's not anything that's really been approved for concussions, for brain injuries. It's just, rest.
Yeah.
To, maybe treat your headache with a Tylenol and just try to hang out.
Now, there may be an exception there with maybe some hormonal treatment, right? Isn't there some interesting research looking at DHEA and even, if I get this wrong, correct me, pregnenolone?
Yeah, definitely. So these, they're definitely hormones, but in the brain, they sometimes are just referred to as neurosteroids. Mm-hmm. And so they don't necessarily have the same hormonal function we might think of, because they do affect cells, but they don't do it in the same ways that we think of when we think, hormones, right? Yep. But so DHEA and pregnenolone, for example, there's, a variety of studies that it's shown these molecules, they can help support, cognitive function, learning and memory, nerve cell health. Even in preclinical data or preclinical studies, DHEA can not just reduce the amount of damage that the animal model is undertaking after injury, but it can also promote the recovery. So it's kind of a double effect, right, where we reduce the injury and then we also promote the recovery, as opposed to just one or the other. And these are things that DHEA and pregnenolone are in the brain. It's naturally occurring. It's contributing to the function in the brain, and so bolstering our status on that is always a good idea to just help maintain that function and try to prevent any damage that comes from injury.
So really, these neuroactive steroids are ultimately brain cell protective in a sense.
Yes,
keeping them functioning the way they should. After an injury, slowing that progression. So that does sound pretty promising. So DHEA, pregnenolone, these are over the counter. So you bump your head, you go to the ER, they watch you overnight, you go home. Should you go and take some DHEA?
I would say yes, especially if you're doing it beforehand. It's something that, it's almost like when you get sick, right? You want to give your body the nutrients that you need. So you want to eat, you want to drink. So in this case, if your body needs these nutrients and it's using these nutrients, it's a good idea to give it what it needs, right? Of course, you should talk to your doctor. They can give you the recommendations that you need. But if I was in that scenario, that's something that I would do.
Probably, I do DHEA regularly, so I might even bump up my dose a little bit or something because I know where and that's what's key if you're taking these hormones beforehand. You should always know your blood levels. Which is nice. And so I know mine's pretty good, and I could bump my dose up a little bit for a while, let that brain heal, and then I can go back down to my normal dose. You mentioned something just about nutrients, just eating well and stuff. I guess if you go home after a concussion, probably best not to drink alcohol, right? You probably don't want to go out and party, right? You probably want to do some healthier things, right?
Yep, that's true. Again, it's rest, and more rest. That's pretty much one of the best things that you can do.
Hydration, good hydration, eating well, get your antioxidants, all that kind of stuff. Right? Yeah. Omega-3s. You had mentioned. You brought this up actually, when we were just talking before the show. What's going on there?
Yeah. So there's some recent data in preclinical studies. Again, mostly with rodents, where they have subjected these mice and these rats to a brain injury. They treat them with high doses of omega-3s, and they've looked at behavior studies, histology, and tissue, and they've found, improved brain performance. There's a neuroprotective effect, so it's helping protect the tissue from the damage, decreased inflammation in the site of injury. And so these omega-3s in the high dose in the preclinical studies are really pointing towards the potential of maybe helping to sort of ameliorate some of that damage and the changes that are happening after injury. This is something that, we still have to look into clinical studies, of course, but it is a promising step, I think, that we have strong data to build a foundation on. And, people are taking omega-3s all the time, right? So not only are we benefiting, our heart and all these other aspects that we're taking the omega-3s for, but we might also have a nice additional benefit.
Maybe it's time to bring it into the ERs, and when someone comes in concussed, let's start looking at it clinically, right? Yeah. I mean, it seems like it makes sense. I mean, we could get people like Robson and Hannah, our producers. We could just knock them on the head.
Yeah, do a test
and
right
then
now.
We do it right now. I got some omegas. No, obviously, you bring those things in, and if there's a protocol for using omega-3s, and ER could follow that, and that would be some interesting data, I think. Yeah. So, anything other than the hormones, or in this case, it's more neuroactive steroids, right, in the brain, omega-3. Anything else nutritionally you see out there?
I mean, mainly again, it's just make sure you're hydrated. Avoid alcohol, right? But water is important. Sometimes when people have these injuries, it's easy to forget whether it's on purpose or not to not drink much. You might not eat just because you don't feel well.
Right,
it's similar again when you're sick. If you don't feel well,
you don't feel like
I don't want to eat. But then you have a bowl of soup, or you have whatever sits well, and all of a sudden you feel a lot better after. So just being smart and trying to be healthy in your choices, and I think that's
So that was Stephen Tapanes. He has a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Miami. Dr. Stephen, thanks for coming on the show
Thank
today.
you for having me. It was a great time.
So listen, liveforeverish.com is a great website to go. Lots of other podcasts there. We're well over 300 now. Go ahead and download some. And when you do, please like, share, comment, and subscribe so you never miss a show. Dr. Stephen at liveforeverish.com, I call it the 1-2 punch. boom, boom, right, Robson? The 1-2 punch. You give your email and you join the Live Foreverish family. And then you can right there subscribe from your favorite aggregate where you like to watch podcasts, the 1-2 punch. Pretty good, right?
Awesome.
LiveForeverish.com. I'm Dr. Mike. Thanks for listening.